Okay, so this is the basics of U.S. history. So it starts here, first Americans. So this is about 30,000 years ago.
30,000.
30,000 years ago. And the idea is that at this time, there was a land bridge that connected Asia and North America.
Yeah.
And so the theory is that that people walked over and then came down and then spread out over North and South America. And so when we talk about Native Americans, these are people that came from, like, as I said, about 30,000 years ago. And they can look at fossils and they can look at archaeological ruins, and they've been able to find that. Okay. The Mayan Empire, so this was in Central America and Mexico, and this was a very big empire that existed. It started around 2000 BC, and they had cities, and they had writing and math and calendars, and it was a big thing, big population of people. There was also the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire was also a very large empire, maybe the largest in the world at that time. The Inca Empire was around the 1400s and 1500s, so 15th, 16th century. And the capital was in what's now Peru. And there's a very famous place there called Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu was the old Inca capital. And again, at that time, in the 16th century, this was maybe the largest empire in the world. So it was a huge empire. You can see that it goes all the way down the South American coast there. Okay. Another empire in that time, it's called the Aztec Empire. Aztec Empire, you can see in the picture, there are lots of people, there are pyramids, big cities. This was in sort of the area that's now Mexico. Here again, very complex society. The big cities, they also had conflicts too. So the Aztecs had conflicts with some of the other peoples at that time. But the main point here is that there was a lot happening in North and South America and Central America before the Europeans came. In North America, there weren't really, really big empires in the same way. Part of that is just because of the land, the way the land is. The way the North American was that they call this Pre-Columbian America. So this is before Columbus, okay? And the idea is that there were lots and lots of different tribes. So all the different colors here are different tribes of people. And some of the different tribes you'll hear, I mean, there were hundreds of them, but some of the big ones were Navajo, Apache, Cherokee, Cree, Sioux. You'll learn more about that in Advanced B. They talk more about Native Americans in Advanced B. But these tribes, they had, some of them were pretty big, and some of them were quite small. And they all had different types of culture and language. And yeah, so it was a lot of diversity here at that time. So then European exploration. So the big year here is 1492. And Christopher Columbus was this kind of the captain of this expedition. Columbus was actually Italian, but he needed money for his ships. So he actually went to Spain, and he asked the Spanish king for money. And at that time, actually, they didn't know about North America and South America and Central America. His idea was that he was going to take a ship and he was going to go all the way around to India. So he thought that he could connect to Asia. And that's why when he got here, he called the Native Americans, he called them Indians, because he thought he was going to India. And he landed in some islands in the Caribbean. You can kind of see over here, these islands over here. And he made several journeys, and they found it. And then he went back and, he reported back to the King of Spain, and then they started looking for gold and looking for other things that they could make them rich. Okay. The next big thing is really the European conquest. This was, the big name here is a guy named Cortez. And Cortez was a Spanish conquistador. And that means he was a conqueror. He came in to try to get the gold and to fight and defeat the local people. So they actually went down more like around the Aztec and the Mayan Empire, like around Mexico. And they went in there, and as you can see in the picture, they killed a lot of people because they wanted the gold. The Mayans and the Aztecs, they had a lot of gold, and they could see the gold. But the thing was that the Europeans had two things that really gave them an advantage. One thing was they had technology like guns and cannons. They had steel, swords. The Mayans and the Aztecs had an advanced culture, but they did not have those kind of weapons. So even though there were few Spaniards, he was Spanish, even though there were few Spaniards, they were able to kill a lot of people. And of course, because they had these weapons. Then the other thing that was the big advantage for the Spanish is that they brought with them diseases. They didn't bring it on purpose at first. Later, they understood that there were diseases. But what happened was in Europe, these diseases had come because the Europeans had these cities. And so the Spaniards were naturally immune to some of these diseases. And so they weren't affected by the diseases. But these diseases just killed thousands and thousands of people in the New World. That's what they called America at that time, the New World. So they just killed thousands and thousands of people. And so very quickly, the Spaniards were able to conquer the Aztec and the Mayan empires and just take gold. And they became super rich. And then, of course, more people wanted to come to get the gold and to get super rich. Very bloody, very sad. A lot of people died. So if you kind of fast forward a little bit, then the big year now is 1607. And at this time, now you have British people coming over. And these British people are also kind of looking for gold. All of the 1500s, you had lots and lots of people coming over to the New World to try to find gold, to try to get rich. 1607, a group of British people came to what is now Jamestown, Virginia. So this was the first place where the British settlers came. Settlers were like early immigrants. They came here to live here. Okay, and they came and they founded this town called Jamestown. And so this was 1607, little town, and it was the first colony. So that means that it was controlled by the British Empire, so England at that time, and this was part of England then. They called it a colony. So at first they were looking for gold, but they couldn't really find a lot of gold. That's not where gold was. So they started farming, especially tobacco, and they started living there. So then another big name that you need to know is the Mayflower. The Mayflower was 1620. This is a big ship that came over, and they landed at a place called Plymouth Rock. Plymouth is now a town in Massachusetts. You can see where Boston is. So this is Plymouth Rock, and this was a group of people called the Pilgrims. Pilgrims, Pilgrims, the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims came over because they were looking for religious freedom. In Europe at that time, there was a lot of conflict between different types of Christians, and they wanted to have their own type of Christianity, and so they came over here to be free. And that's very important in American history, this kind of religious freedom. We'll come back to that later. But that's one of the main reasons that they came and started these colonies. So then, if you kind of, again, fast forward, in the next thing you have is the establishment of the colonies. And this took place, 1620, 1600s, 1700s, but more and more people start coming, and they start making these colonies, which are basically, they're not states. At this time, America is not a country. America is part of England. So that's what a colony is. A colony means that it's controlled by another country. So there were 13 original colonies, and you can see that mostly it was just the East Coast, the Northeast, and the South. And these were the original 13 colonies. There were also areas in the north with Canada, and then also in some of the southern parts over here, like around where Louisiana, there was French colonies also. And there were also even Dutch colonies, but later the British bought it from the Dutch. And that's actually, New York was originally New Amsterdam. But then the Dutch sold it to the British, and it became New York. So at this time, there was a big slave trade. So to understand the slave trade, you need to understand a little bit about what was going on at that time. So at that time, you had a lot of people growing. There was agriculture. They were growing farms. And the big thing they were growing was sugar. So sugar was a really big crop at that time. So what would happen is the ships would bring slaves from Africa. They'd come over here to these islands, and they would become the workers. And slaves means that they were working and they didn't get any money, and they didn't have any rights. They were owned by somebody else. So there was a slave owner. That was the guy who owned the farm. They sometimes called them plantations. And so the slaves would come, they would bring the slaves over, then they would grow the sugar, and then they would take the sugar and they'd bring it up to the colonies. And then they would do all sorts of, they would sell the sugar, they would make rum, which is an alcohol, and then they would take those products and then take them back to Africa or back to Europe to sell. And so this was the slave trade. And at this time, very important number, so between 1525 and 1866, that's the slave trade, 1525 to 1866, 12.5 million slaves. 12.5 million slaves were brought over by ship. And you have to understand, too, that when they were bringing them over by ship, it took a long time, and it was terrible conditions. People died on the ships. They were not treated well. They were really horrible, horrible conditions. But this was part of the economy back then. This is what was going on. Okay, big date, 1776. the Revolutionary War. You've got here, you see there's the Declaration of Independence. You see a picture of Washington. And then you see a battle between the colonists, who are now the new Americans, and then the British. So basically at this time, the colonists, the people who were living there, they said, you know what, we want to be an independent country. We don't want to be part of England anymore. The big reason was that they had to pay taxes to the British government, but they had no voice in the government. They had no representation. So they would pay taxes, but they couldn't make any decisions about the policies at that time. And so they decided that they wanted to be independent. And so the Revolutionary War, George Washington was the main general. Later, he became the first president. The Revolutionary War was it started in 1775, and then it went to 1783. It was long. It took a long time. 1775 to 1783. At this time, the French supported the United States. So the French and the British were kind of enemies at that time. And so the French decided to support the United States. The United States wins. They won independence. And then in 1789, they made the Constitution. The Constitution is the highest law in the United States. And you can see in the picture, these guys, they got together and they made this piece of paper called the Constitution. They also wrote the Bill of Rights. So the Constitution was, the idea was that they were going to have a strong central government, but they would also have states, and the states had rights. And this was the big balance, because some of the states didn't want to be part of the country. Some of them just wanted to be independent. But the idea was that they needed to have a balance between strong central power, federal power, and state power. And that's the Constitution. Okay. The Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was a document that said what the individuals could have. And so you can see on here the Bill of Rights. The first right is freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, which means news. And these are and freedom to meet. So this is the first right, and it's one of the most fundamental rights. Freedom of religion, freedom of the press, that's the newspapers, all of these things. These are the basic rights. And then there are other rights here that are also listed, and you can see them later. We often talk about the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers were these guys who started and wrote the Constitution. So the Founding Fathers, starting here, this is Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, and then coming over here, this is John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and then James Madison, and then Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson became our third president. John Adams was our second president. Okay. Benjamin Franklin is a very famous American, one of my favorites, and many people think he was a president, but he wasn't. He was not president. He was too old at that time. He was already very old when the United States became independent. Okay. Very quickly, one of the things that the Constitution did was it set up three basic parts of government. There's the legislative, which makes the laws, the executive, which carries out the laws, that's the president. And then there's the judicial, and the judicial is the judges. And there's a balance. That's the idea, is that there's a balance between those three parts, and that no person can get too much power. The War of 1812, this is a conflict with the British. And basically at this time, what was happening was that there was a kind of trade. There was a lot of trade. Remember, back with the slave trade, there was a lot of trade between the New World, America, and Europe. But at this time, the Britain and France were at war, and the American ships were getting captured a lot. And so, and getting captured by the British. And so this was basically a war where they were trying to, the Americans were trying to make sure that the British and the other people were not kind of capturing their ships. Yeah. At this time, this is very important, 1823, so the War of 1812 was 4 years. America was able to push back the British and get their trade. And at this time in 1823, they had something called the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe is M-O-N-R-O-E, Monroe Doctrine. This is basically a policy America said to Europe. They said, America is for Americans. And we want no more colonies in America, North America or South America. At this time, in South America, some of the countries were forming also. They were getting independence from Spain. And so the idea, the Monroe Doctrine said, hey, stay out of America, no more colonies. Of course, the Europeans were like, who are you? Why do you think you can do that? And then, but that was sort of what was happening at that time. I'm going to stop here, and we will continue more tomorrow.